So my name's Ian Hickie. I'm the Co-Director of Health and Policy at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney, and you will not be hearing from me for the next 3/4 of an hour or an hour, as appears in the program. I get Pip to come back up. Helen Christensen, who's been the director, just stepped down as the Director of the Blackdog Institute at the University of Sydney. Peter Baume, who's sitting here in the front row. And Jackie Troy. Where's Jackie gone? Oh, death it back, Jackie. We haven't lost Susan. Good, good. We are going to have a discussion here. I was glad to see that people were very animated almost there at the end. That idea that there's something out there that's smarter than us is just so fascinating. You know? I was worried that people might have dropped off by this point, but they haven't. Thank you, Jackie. We are on the fabulous lands of the Gadi people. We want to get back outside there as soon as possible. But before we do, Susan, I must thank Susan as the President of the Royal Society of New South Wales for organising the forum this year. And when she contacted me earlier this year, I forget when, because I kind of lost track. She said, look, I want to have something about brain sciences, but not really. There are really big questions out there in the world at the moment, really big challenges that we face. And she started with my personal favourite, which was evil. You know, there's bad stuff happening, and a lot of that seems to be underpinned by human behaviour that doesn't really seem to have a capacity to cope with the challenges that we face in a 21st century global world. Is there something about us, about the way we're wired or the way we work, or discussing others, the way we believe, the way we understand, that's preventing us moving into the 21st century and coping with the 21st century? Then she enrolled people like George, who said, well, there's a problem here. We've got this 100,000-year-old technology, you know. It doesn't really drive well in the global world. It's a small world network. It's used to dealing with people up close in small groups, surviving in various ways as part of a group. The global world we live in is completely different. So George's basic behind us, no, we're stuffed. You know, because basically it is not that adaptable to the challenges we face. An important kind of set of conversations we had about really the roles of the various academies is that they bring deep disciplinary science and very different ideas about the world and how the world is constructed into that discussion. And really importantly from the Royal Society point of view, and I think for the academies, the question is, are we of any use in the wider worlds in which we exist? We can amuse ourselves for very long periods of time, and we can have deep conversations about the areas in which we are each in, and I'm sure we'll be fascinated by that. I was reminded of this some years ago when I was a committee chaired by the National Health and Medical Research Council with the CEO at the time, who was meeting with the heads of the federal departments, the secretaries of all the departments, and lined up all these really great science people in health and medical research who all turned up and said, we have answers that matter. And the secretary said, not to the questions we're asking, which are what actually afflicts us. So we thought this part of the day should be devoted to, okay, all the stuff you've heard today from really brilliant people doing really great work is what they believe are the answers that matter, or could matter. And we did select, as the organising committee, two particularly important phases of that, which I'll come back to in our wider society. The importance of child development for the future. I can't remember exactly who said that the children are the sentinels of what is happening. Because brain development is affected very much by the environment in which they're growing up, their changes in behaviour and function tell us much more quickly what is happening in the society than those of us who are relatively impervious at a certain stage, who have become fixed. Was it George who said those who prevent progress in their field, you know, are the real senior people in their field, you know, so the children. The other, of course, is related to ageing. I've got Peter Baume here. I don't know if Peter was responsible for this. He was a much more sensible minister. I think the worst thing ever happened in my professional life was the intergenerational report. Ageing is just a cost. Ageing is just a problem. It's something the rest of us, the real earners, have to kind of do to take care of the rest of you who are cost to society as you age. And two of the biggest challenges, and I'll come back to this in a mental wealth sense shortly, is, you know, the importance of two phases of life. Importantly, child development and, of course, ageing. We long outlive our utility now due to our health and medical research, long beyond reproducing, some of us have done a lot of. We've got a lot of stuff out there. We don't know what should be hanging around. We're just using up resources, as George pointed out. But these are two of the big challenges. The society we have now, long lives, complex lives, and I think very importantly, as raised throughout the day, perhaps in our Western cultures, more disconnected lives as we live that thing. What are the implications of that? So do we actually have those capacities? So I wanted to get four more intelligent people than me up here to start with and ask them, out of all the answers they've heard today, do they answer any of the questions, or do they help them to think about any of the questions that they think matter? Now I'm going to start at the far end, because most people in the Royal Society will know Peter Baume. When I was very young, Peter was very prominent in both his political life as a senator and taking intelligent ideas, I thought, or an idea of intelligence into national politics, which I thought was really interesting to actually engage with politics. And then his life, both through education and his work in those areas, and continues to be part of that. If you pop down to ANU, you'll see a really important thing. You'll see his name on buildings. We discussed earlier in the day, they must think he's dead, but he's not. He's alive and here and with us. Peter, do you think any of the answers that you've heard today help to answer the questions that you worry about? And those, of course, who are making political decisions, they worry about.
Well, thank you, Ian. One of the recurring themes earlier in the day from some people has been a variant on the sentence, "What the world needs most is more money for my cause." Now, you've got to keep saying that. But logic alone is not going to win any political argument. There's got to be the pushing of a political hot button as well. You need both things. So Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins were not important for themselves, but they were very important for the causes that they articulated. The community was ready to move, and then policy change could occur. Andrew Lee spoke by video today, but apart from him, I don't think there are many people here who've sat round a cabinet table. In cabinet, when there's a consideration of an issue where good and bad are quite different, decisions are quite easy. And 80% of the agenda of any cabinet meeting is decided within 20 minutes. And the other 20% takes 3 hours because the issues are balanced, good and bad. And the politicians who are sitting around that cabinet table are smart, they're able, and they understand what you've said. They know the issues exist, but they're faced with a choice between A and B, where A and B are fairly close. And the economist here will tell you all about the issue of opportunity cost. If you spend $1 on A, you can't spend it on B. Just think for a moment about the size of the budget cake sitting in the centre of the table. It's going to be cut into slices. You're going to get a slice, and so's the person next to you. And the people around the cabinet table have 3 lots of responsibilities. They're politicians and they're responsible for their electorate. They're responsible for the country and they're responsible for their portfolio. So a lot of them are going to be interested in getting money for their portfolio. The Minister for Roads wants more money to build roads and build bridges and so on. So either the budget cake is going to increase in size so everyone can get a slightly bigger slice, or your increase is going to come at someone else's expense. So the person to your left and your right suddenly becomes, well, an ally maybe if you're very eloquent, but they know that your success will mean less for them. So keep that in mind when people are considering the causes for which they're fighting. Keep articulating what you're saying, but remember something else is needed before you're going to win politically.
Thank you, Peter. Helen, who's been involved in a lot of the complex issues around mental health and their wider application in Australia, particularly around suicide prevention and some of the wider kind of issues, and must say importantly in terms of the last discussion, the wider use of technology to do things in the world, in our world, I think Andrew Channon alluded to this morning, it's assumed to only be able to occur between one human and another. What do you think, Helen, in terms of the extent to which the things that people have been commenting on, or which bits of what you've heard might contribute most to answering questions that matter?
So I guess my response would be slightly orthogonal to that.
Oh, go right. Go where you like.
I think that there was I'll describe an article that was published in Nature in January this year, which basically said that our innovation had stalled and that we were not making the level of progress that we should be. And they put it down to a number of things. They looked at, it was a very well-controlled article, as you can imagine, for a Nature paper. And basically they were saying, we're working in silos and we're not communicating with each other and we're getting smaller in the areas in which we're working, and we're not leveraging the knowledge that we have across disciplines. They also made the point, and I think it's a really good one, that you need a particular device in order to kind of kickstart some of this innovation. And one of those things is technology. So whether it's artificial intelligence or the technologies that we've been using, the new tools that we have in order to do things, these provide a little bit of a beacon about what we can do. So I think we should think differently about how we structure our science. And going back to the questions you were talking about, Ian, I think we need to have moonshots that we all try and work towards with all the strength of the disciplines that we have to conceptualise problems in the way that you were talking about earlier, but also in what sort of mechanisms and efforts that we can bring in. Because at the moment, our science is basically working off grants, and we virtually know what we're going to do when we get that grant. We don't really think that much. And I think congratulations to the organisers today, because I think this has been a very fruitful conference in bringing together different points. And I think this is what we as academies should be doing more and more of, rather than concentrating on just describing what we're doing in our own areas.
So what are your top 2 or 3 moonshots? In the current
well,
world.
I dare not say this in front of all the AI people, but I think, we need centres where people are freed from doing their grants to think about the question like, what's the new therapy, if that's the right way of describing it? And what you were saying before, is it, we've had Freud, we've had CBT, we're moving into different stratification models, etc. But what's the new way of thinking about how we change ourselves so that we have better mental health? And maybe large language models or some of the generative AI opportunities, and bringing in different people. So that would be one to me. Like, we are failing in our therapies, and we talk about personalisation. That would be a moonshot. How can we prove that? For a start.
Okay, now I want to move on to Pip, who's who's had the co-organising role, and most of the time this year, actually, I haven't been in the country most of the year, so most of the organising has actually been done by Pip and Sue very effectively. But Pip took on a great job a little while ago as the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Education at Sydney University. I've got to tell you, that's a challenge. Okay, that's probably a moonshot type activity, trying to change the educational framework under which Sydney University has operated for the last 175 years. And I said to Pip, and we had a conversation like, why'd you ever do that? Like, I just couldn't think of anything worse to take on as a challenge. And she said, because education really matters. Because it really matters how we teach. It really matters how we think. And Pip's been associated actually with a major restructure of the educational kind of framework at the University of Sydney. I think it's fair to say to be less narrow in its disciplinary base and hopefully respond to current generations in a broader way of different experiences, to pick up the Einstein quote earlier on, different experiences of learning, not just being subject to being told what to think. Is that a fair summary? So Pip, what do you think about in terms of, in the way you've heard and the way people think about brain function, mental function, its ramifications for how we educate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just before I get to it, I just want to say I love Helen's idea about tackling some big questions together, because I do think occasions like today where we actually tackle a sort of theme from a number of different disciplinary perspectives, it just sparks ideas and connections, to use the metaphor of the great big brain out there that includes us all, that we haven't necessarily thought of before. And I must say, I think from an educational point of view, I really do think the development of individuals who can certainly gain an expertise in a discipline and understand it thoroughly and well it's a long-standing approach to education, and it's one we shouldn't move away from. But the capacity to actually have meaningful conversations with people who work in other, or come from other backgrounds, I just think that's something that we've really missed a bit, particularly at the tertiary level. I think it's much less problematic in school education, although I'm not an expert in that. It just seems a little bit less siloed. And I do think the kinds of issue, or the approach that Helen just talked about for us as a scholarly community, I actually think those kinds of experiences are just as important for our students, because I think it's through the exploration of things that are beyond what we know that we really do build the capacity to work across the boundaries, and that's just a fundamental thing for education and for success in work, research and life.
So let's move on to Jackie, but I just want to recognise the impact of Jackie's way of thinking on my own work. I've had the great pleasure to work with Jackie in recent times on a number of large projects. One she just alluded to in passing was the use of technology to assist families, particularly mothers and children, with early childhood development in Afghanistan and other countries through technology. It's a combination of technology, group thinking, delivered in countries like Afghanistan, which continued after the Taliban had retaken over the joint. And it brings together social scientists, in particular digital technologists. We got involved out of the neuroscience of development, what were the sort of strands, with a strong focus on what Adam was still doing about social cognition. The most important things that humans develop is not simply statistical or adding up or mimicking calculator-like other stuff. It's capacity to operate in social groups. And our discussion about what is evil or what's psychopathic or what is the human thing that leads to such evil, of course, it's the decline in concern and the loss of empathy for others that actually leads people or underpins some of the most terrible things that humans can actually do. And then that kind of tension between what is good for the individual versus what is good for the group on an ongoing basis. So that particular project was unique, and Jackie and I had been working on. And we've constantly had to look at how different cultures around the world, that project looks at the use of technology, neuroscience of child development, and each place that we've rolled that out. I got to go to Uzbekistan last year, in Kazakhstan, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, around the world. Each place is different in its cultural settings. What most of those places have that we do not have is very strong transgenerational and kinship relationships, ways of speaking with each other, but mutual responsibilities, etc. And I love this great respect for older people, and their role and their contribution to the emotional growth of two generations, not their children, but their grandchildren and others, and the role of SIBShips and others in those particular works. And the second bit is the influence of Jackie's thinking in the period immediately after the referendum, when people like myself are kind of going, what do we think now? I had the pleasure of doing a webinar with Jackie and Professor Pat Dudgeon, who's one of the leading Indigenous psychologists in the country, about an important thing, which was to stop and think. The Indigenous people did not immediately respond to the political cycle, did not immediately engage in the analysis of the Yes campaign, said we're going to take time to think about it. In my own house, I only enjoy an elderly woman from Gladstone, Queensland. I contacted her, hadn't seen her in time. She said, Ian, I'm not speaking this week. I'll talk to you next week. And Jackie pointed out, we need to take time to grieve. We need to take time to actually consider, not all the rationality, what to do next, immediately come together. We need to take time to think about the emotional impact of all of that, all that had gone beforehand, who's most affected, and not immediately retreat to the kind of rational, solve it kind of way that we would do, and very much do as an individual thing. Jackie and Pat convened online, using technology to bring people together, 300 people from around the country, to just consider and share their response to the referendum, not to the outcome, but just to the position in which we find ourselves. And I thought, what a different way to think about the problem. Made no sense to our political systems, made no sense to our immediate media, Our people who are asking people on the night, what are you immediately going to do, or the Prime Minister the next day, what are you immediately going to do, or what's going to be the solution now for closing the gap? A different way of thinking about stuff, collectively, with strong emphasis on the emotionality required to empower human behaviour, to, I think, do what Helen's alluding to act collectively, to actually think about the bigger stuff that's at stake. So, Jackie, out of all the things you've heard today, and the interaction with it, because you've been doing this kind of interaction with both neuroscience and with technology for some time, has it helped at all? Is it helping at all? Is it helping to solve big problems, or is it just a weird way of thinking?
Well, look, I reiterate, and Pip said to me in the break, I think you're onto something with, the work I'd like to do with languages, the 407 missing languages. Well, I should say there are about 15, as I said, that are still strong, and then there are a whole lot of others like my own. Well, my mob were in this particular building here, right in this room, singing a song that probably hadn't been sung for 150 years of my people. And in that moment, we were all Ngaragu together, of one voice, using our language and being culturally ourselves. Now, AI could really help us with getting our language back. That's just one kind of technology. Look, something as simple as, I love the idea of, what was it, idiotic AI or not so intelligent AI? I mean, I remember AI being a program I used with a breadboard. That's how long ago, actually doing. But it was, it can help us generate language that we can interact with, engage with. So for all these languages that we only have fragmentary information about, we can input. I'd love to have the money. Hello, we need to get round the cabinet. Yeah, I used to manage the Broadcasting and Languages program for Australia for Aboriginal languages. But anyway, we could input what we know about languages and then generate a way of using my language. But I would never want to take out the human. I would never want to miss the moment of walking with my real people, into here and singing our song, and the engagement of the humans, the audience, and really no silicon. By the way, you can make a silicon brain responsible. You can just squash it if it doesn't do what you want it to do. So, but it's that sort of, to take the human out of what we are, that would be a huge loss. And what I would say as an Indigenous person, as an Aboriginal person, back to our response to things like the referendum, for me, the death of my husband, I wouldn't want to miss those experiences and feel the grief and feel the joy, and nothing can ever synthetically create that for me. Well, you can say it could, but it wouldn't be me experiencing it. So, what I take away from today is there are huge possibilities around understanding our brains and how to manage it and care for it, our living brain, and how to augment what we do with technology. But we should really never ever lose what we are here today. We should do more of this. Sitting in a room without engaging with other people and not sharing ideas is not going to create the brilliant, random kind of things that humans do. And I know machines can do it too, but I don't think they have as much fun. And they don't have the tactile responses that we do, that sort of, everything to do with what we are as human. And this is what
They don't eat.
They don't eat, they don't drink, they aren't going to get Alzheimer's, well, maybe they will, I don't know. But it's that, the human, keeping the human in all of it, which I think, but also understanding yourself as part of an animated world. And it is great to think all these boards were trees, and there's still something of those trees in them. That tree out there has that spirit, all the birds and everything were engaging. They were all looking in the windows, looking it up. And for us, that is because there is this multi-dimensional engagement that is always happening. And no technology can really give us that. We have to have something of us as humans
in there
to keep that going.
So the other thing that Susan's agenda here was we should engage in a sort of over-political way. The academies needed to engage politically, partly picking up what Peter was saying. So three of the people, unfortunately, couldn't be here today. They've sort of had this conversation with you and working with us. And I wonder if we could just bring up the slides here. We're about the future of Australia. Jeff Gallop, who was previously the Premier of WA and had a depressive episode of which he's recovered and then works with us. Sam Mostyn, who now works for the Prime Minister's agenda on female pay equality and growth in key areas of the caring economy. And Victor Dominello, who's a previous minister actually here in New South Wales for services. Now, for those who aren't from New South Wales, we used to have, and I don't know whether you still have in Victoria and elsewhere, these crazy systems where you line up for your licence and you line up for your registry for this and you've got all these different audit agencies. And he completely transformed that thing in New South Wales called Services New South Wales. So now it exists. Most of that stuff's online, you don't go there, anything can be done on any set of levels, and the huge transformation of that. He refers to it as, when people say it can't be done, he goes, I've walked on the moon, I've done it. You can take human services and you can put technology at the middle of it. You just have to be prepared to put the information and people at the centre of services that are not. All of them are involved with us in growing concepts around the mental health. Where does Australia go? You may or may not know, but I have a daughter who works for the Reserve Bank who's very proud of the fact that Australia used to be considered at the top of the world economically. We had, whatever it was, 20-something years of continuous growth. We got ourselves on the front page of The Economist for doing that. At the time, suicide rates were actually going up, mental health of young people was getting worse, and the challenges are associated. So we seem to be economically thriving. What Peter was alluding to, the cake was getting bigger. GDP was kind of growing, but were we okay? And now I think in the post-COVID era and the other challenges we face, it's an interesting time because the economic discourse now is economically, we're not okay. Cost of living is going up, housing affordability is going up, there's uncertainty, interest rates, etc. And so the political discourse is not one just of growth, it's now of all the economic challenges. Do we have time for social transformation? Do we have time for anything else? Or is the new economic challenge now even more demanding of attention? Very importantly, the UK Government Office of Science back in 2008 produced a summary of all of the areas that were at the time for what was at the time termed the mental wealth of nations. Now many of us have knocked off that term ever since and tried to get the political class. We did have Malcolm Turnbull talking this at one stage. It isn't just about mental health or it isn't just about GDP. What is our collective mental wealth? That for countries to prosper, both economically and socially, you've got to focus on the growth of the collective mental wealth. It's not an individual brain capital thing. It's not the add up of all the individuals in that society. It's our collective mental wealth and what that may constitute. And they did develop a part of that. It's well worth looking at. That was 2008. It's still well worth looking at. They developed a lifespan kind of approach. You know, we spend from -9 months to 22 years investing in the brain and social development of our kids. Economists would see it as a big cost, but at least for kids we call it an investment. So I say to my kids, we've invested a lot. Time to repay it, take care of me, live long lives. I expect a large return on investment. They're not so personally sure. There's one at the edge where it seems to fall off with ageing, which is not necessarily the case. It comes back to what I was so glad that Glenda said. I've been telling people that forever. No one believes me, that you don't lose those cells as you age. It's actually the microglia, it's the glia, which are the cells which are most responsive to the environment, right? They're the ones that are reacting to the environment all the time. That's problematic. And they underpin the synaptic connections. For the separate podcast I'm associated with, never retire. And clearly people in this room are never retiring. They come out. George will come out at any time to talk to anyone in any coffee shop, anywhere. Guaranteed. Preferably in Greece. Preferably on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. You don't necessarily lose that. That association with ageing is a cohort effect reported in these of those who've become ill in terms of their health. Those who are still working or are actually good health, their brain capital does not decline. But that was very important to have this kind of capacity kind of idea. We've been working very much on building new models of this, and I'm tied up in economic discourse. This is the thing that Jeff Gallop and Sam Mostyn and others, we have to have a new metric of this in this country. We would propose the metric of mental wealth. So we're trying to do what the economists do. We're trying to build these complicated models and put in the dollar value of social and mental wealth alongside GDP. Now, the current treasurer, you should never say the current treasurer, but we all know they come and go over time. You know, he says, yeah, wellbeing economy. Lots of people say wellbeing economy. But what does it mean? Because at the same time the government says it's only cost of living that matters, or it's only interest rates that matters, or as you just heard about architecture, it's only housing affordability. So we just got to build as many as we can, as close to something else. Very narrow kind of perspectives. So we are tied up in this wider issue. And just for example, some early modelling of this, of the dollar value of what people do through volunteering and caring, which Andrew Lee alluded to earlier on. So just the dollar value of that is about $285 billion a year. So, do you think, Peter, Do you think we can get, you know, we sometimes, and I guess it's a human capability, real crisis, immediate in front of your eyes, you know, my God, we're going to have to do something.
See, I think human personality hasn't changed, and crises, Tony knows this better than anyone, that the crises like the COVID one are going to recur and recur and recur. And we just have to be ready for them. And since our personalities haven't changed, governments will respond in an ad hoc way.
Yes, we didn't really dwell on the Sharon, and others may want to comment. Forgetting is an essential human capability. Other questions? Yes, down the back.
One of the things that occurred to me in listening to all of the talks today was that they weren't just proposing, I want more money for my bit.
I thought they were pretty good about that, yes.
But they're also saying, here's a solution, but it isn't going to happen tomorrow. These are long-term things. But it's also in requesting, for example, funds to assist in particular areas such as early diagnosis or early intervention or whatever else. Almost all of them propose that ultimately it would be a cost saving because you're not going to come back. And to your point about human capital, you're maximising that human potential and capital. So it's actually, the issue here is not one of implementation or a pie getting bigger or smaller. It's short-termism. And that also speaks to COVID and the crisis response rate, which is basically, had one been prepared, and the UK has a huge review going on at the moment about exactly that, had they been prepared and done any of the things that they'd learned from SARS, they could have saved themselves £600 billion. So a lot of this is down to seeing that there is a return on this investment, and that's the way you might get economists and business people to understand why it's important to make these investments.
Now, Jackie might want to comment here, but courtesy of Jackie and these projects, I found myself involved with Kazakhstan during these particular things, who have a 7-generation approach. Let's try this trick in your own room. Can you name the previous 7 generations from which you are personally derived? I got back to the west coast of Ireland and got lost. I did find my grandfather on the parish registry in Galway. After that, got no idea. I could find things, can't say. You know, it's a really interesting idea of continuity. And I think Jackie's been saying this continuously. We don't just have short-term in planning, we have short-term thinking about ourselves. And this has become very individualistic in our own culture, but also our own selves over time. Do you want to... So I wonder whether this is all humans, or it's, what did Jackie say earlier on? White, Anglo-Saxon, English idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great pity that Australia doesn't want to learn from the way in which Aboriginal people, we organise ourselves. I wasn't joking when I said earlier that I think we've spent at least, 72,000 to 120,000 years dealing with social complexity and dealing with it very elegantly. This country was lightly managed, we lived well, we were human, we killed each other, we fought with each other, you know, we made babies with each other, we did what people do, but fundamentally, and the knowledge of how we managed ourselves really effectively, and that was our technology. It was our technology. It was the development of, 407 languages developed because that's 407 different socio-political groups of people who don't want to be the same as the people next door, but they don't want to always be killing them, right? They want to be interacting and engaging. And, in the end, really all technology is now is the use of language systems to produce technology, machines, if you like, that will think for us and do work for us. Look, I have to say this, on this very spot here, Philip and his fellow First Fleeters, the officers, were learning the language of the Sydney area. And one of the things they learnt was that the Aboriginal people here thought what the British were doing was ridiculous. They were wasting all their time building things, running around, exhausting themselves, not eating well.
Building very elaborate houses, I must say.
Building very elaborate houses out of Aboriginal sandstone. But, and so in thinking about how to describe what these people were doing, which was work, which they said was what you should be doing, work, and making use of the land. I mean, of course, we hadn't used the land. And they said, well, maybe serious creative play is about, so it's play. It looks like what everybody does most of the day, which is enjoy themselves. And then you spend a bit of time feeding yourself. And while you're doing that, you're enjoying that because it's social activity with other people. So you're never doing things just by yourself, stuck in a room, staring at a computer screen. You're always active with other people. So keeping that kind of thinking and you know, people matter, as you said, the generations of people matter. Keeping that kind of thinking into this world that we've got now, where you've got, you know, look, technology makes life easier and it frees humans up to do things that they should be doing, which is smelling the roses. One of the last things my husband said was he wished he'd had time to smell the roses, to just be human and not have to spend all day in super secure rooms, bunkers, dealing with computer programming. He did love doing that. His serious creative play mattered to him, but he would have liked a bit more time just to be with us.
So on the short-termism question, because this is going to come back to a point I think Susan quite rightly highlighted, we're very critical of political classes and the election things we have as if it is their fault. But what is the role of the institutions that we are all part of in the longer-term kind of sets of processes? I'm going to ask people about this, because in some interesting discussions we had about whether Sydney University is very good at any of these things. You know, the universities and the education systems often come up as the kind of institutional things about longer-term memory and planning and getting beyond short-termism and creating skill sets and people who don't necessarily just do that, which is so damaging. Do you want to comment, Pip?
Yeah, sure. And you're giving me a second chance to answer the first
Yeah,
question.
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, no, I didn't quite get there. So I do think, and I think it came up today in a number of different contexts, the sort of integration of sort of social and more cognitive skills is something that happens early in life, and it's something that continues through life. And I think at the universities, we just haven't paid enough attention to the non-cognitive aspects of the development of young people. And I think it's almost as, and a lot of the sort of natural mechanisms for encouraging a lot of the informal learning activity that took place, and particularly as a result of COVID, have been eroded partly by the universities getting much bigger, partly by a change in the sort of economic conditions and students needing to do more paid work, and partly through, you know, competition with a whole range of other activities, especially those on, you know, social media and all of that, which we heard about today too, and all of that goes through the lifespan. And I think part of what we need to do is just make sure those opportunities exist for young people to actually develop the skills that will make them good members of collectives.
You mean actually come to university and learn by experience?
Yes, I do. And not only learn by experience, but learn by experience together with others.
Together, that's what I meant. Together, in groups, yes. So, yes, further question. As time is rapid. I've started drinking with the referendum, everyone else will be joining in shortly.
One of the things that I studied when I looked at universities about 25 years ago was that there were two types. There were communities of practice who established the engineering and sort of outcome-oriented universities, and then there were communities of interest who thought about things very carefully. And so when we started working on this, we made a distinction between communities of practice who are trying to do things that transform the architecture of our societies at the kind of physicality level, and then we want to think more clearly about the future. And those were communities of interest. Now, if you look at the universities around the world, there were two types. There were very practical universities. Strathclyde is a really good example. And there were very sort of thought-centric universities. And I think we sort of oscillate between these. But it seems to me that very often we confuse the fact that practice is limited by the laws of physics generally at some point. And you therefore can make up things in your head that are never going to be true in practice, and then you are not living in the reality of practice anymore. And one of the things that worries me at the moment about a lot of the discourse that happens is people imagine futures in their heads that are not connected to practical reality. So how do we get the new synergy, the new genetic code of practice synthesizing with imagination in a way that is productive and plausible and rooted in the reality and the struggles of real people who live in ground truth.
So just finally here, I'm going to have to channel Jeff Gallup here. This is the conversation I have with Jeff most days. Because he works in the university, you're really interesting people. But most of you would make hopeless decision makers. Because this balancing of the competing sets of ideas, trying to bring the best of what is out there down into practical application in people's lives, within the culture within which we live, at the time that we are living, within the constraints of the way that we respond cognitively and emotionally to those things. I'm not sure why Pip just referred to those other skills as non-cognitive. I'd say they were very cognitive skills in the sort of social cognition or the emotional kind of world. How do you kind of do that? And I think that has been hopefully the hope of today, is to actually present a lot of what is really going on in the area, to do it across the various academies and what they all bring in their own rich traditions into that area, and then to be able to convene a group like this to talk about it. And I'm sure that we thank the Governor for access to the home. My own view would be that her own brain is considerably different in the 21st century than before, because our brains are changing all the time. Those little microglia that are running around are knocking off synaptic connections or not in responses to the environments in which you are currently living. And on that optimistic note, I think we're going to adjourn to the garden, aren't we, Susan? Thank you for coming.